these. So the first one I'm looking at here, I'm going to post on Moodle called comma splices. So this one, it really has to do with run-on sentences and a specific kind of run-on sentence. What I've noticed since I've been teaching is that the kind of run-on sentence I see the most is one where we just kind of use a comma to keep a sentence going instead of like either ending the sentence or using the word and or something like that. I think we do this because of texting. In texting, we never want to use a period, like we talked about in that how the internet has changed the language essay from weeks ago. If you use a period when you're texting, everyone's going to think you're mad at them, right? So we just kind of split up our ideas with commas when we're texting or on the internet and stuff. And that's fine for that. But if you're doing that on an essay, and if you have a professor who's like, really being a jerk about grammar, that can become a problem. So I think what we see is run-on sentences where we're kind of using commas to split up our thoughts, and you can call that a comma splice. So that's what this little reading is about. Like it says, a comma splice is a sentence in which only a comma is used to separate what could be two separate sentences. So that's really the main thing here is realizing when something could be its own sentence. So for instance, they give this example here, and again, you guys can follow along. But it says, Snow White arrived late, comma. She has a bad habit of being tardy. So this doesn't work with the comma just in the middle there because Snow White arrived late. That could be a sentence. And then the other part of it, she has a bad habit of being tardy. That could also be a sentence. So anything that's like a full thought that could stand on its own, they call that an independent clause. And all that means is that it could be its own sentence if we wanted to put a comma there. But sometimes we have reasons that we want to join things together because, it's on the same topic, or we just want to make our sentences more interesting and not so short. But we can't just separate it with a comma. Some other examples that they give here, and again, I'm going to post this, so I would try to follow along. This is on the comma splices document. So they say here at the bottom of the second page, they give an example. It says, fish travel in schools, comma, whales travel in pods. Again, you can't just use a comma to split this up because fish travel in schools could be its own sentence, and whales travel in pods could be its own sentence. So you could say fish travel in schools and whales travel in pods, and you wouldn't need a comma, or you could use the word but or something like that. Or you could just make it two separate sentences: fish travel in schools, period, whales travel in pods, period. So the big thing with run-on sentences, if this is something that professors have taken points off on their essays or something people keep talking about to you, one of the big problems I think is when we try to use only a comma to join together what could be two separate sentences. What you can do instead is either make them two separate sentences or add in the word and or the word but or yet or one of those kind of connector words with the comma. So you can go through this whole thing and it gives a few more examples. But yeah, this is something that I would try to do like, in the editing process. So I wouldn't worry about this when you're first trying to write a draft and stuff. I would write your draft, do your revisions, and then at the end, I would just kind of go in and see how long your sentences are. Some other things to look for, if you have a sentence that's more than like 4 lines long, there's probably a way to split it up. And again, just ask yourself, is there any way that I could break this up? Could any of these things be their own sentence? Like, what if I put the period here? Could that be its own sentence? And then we can avoid doing these kind of run-on sentences. Also, if you're using the word and or the word but like multiple times in one sentence, then there's probably a way to split it up. I would say that students, it's a bigger problem to have run-on sentences than to have sentences that are too short. So if you ever feel like it's just getting like really long, I would look for a way to split it up and see if you can. Okay, so yeah, and I would look through the rest of those examples there, but they're all on the same thing of using a comma to split up what could be two separate sentences. So that's the comma splices one. Now I want to go over to the other reading handout that I posted, which I'm going to be calling grammar explanations that we posted on Google. So again, I feel like a lot of this stuff works better with looking at the examples, So I would just go through and read through all of this, but I'll just go through some of the examples here. And just to give you a sense. So the first thing I have here is kind of a list of what, like 6 different instances when you want to use commas. And I would say if you can get used to like these specific rules that I have listed here, you'll eliminate like 90% of your comma errors. There are other rules. There's other like strange, weird rules that aren't listed here, but those just don't come up very often. And that's honestly the thing with a lot of grammar stuff. Like maybe I'll try to talk about this since people asked about it, but I had people asking about using semicolons. And the quick answer to that is you could get away with just never using one. I'll tell you how to use one towards the end of this video, but you don't really have to either. You can get away colons, semicolons. You can get away with just not using this stuff. Sometimes it's cool. Sometimes it can make our writing more interesting, or just to say it the way we want to say it. But you could get away with just never using them. Okay, so some of the different comma rules here. The first one I have, it says an opening phrase. This is when you start a sentence with a word like however. Like the example I give, however, some people are not so sure about this. You would go comma after however. So there's like a certain set of phrases that you use as like an opening word. It's kind of like a transition type word, like in a sentence, like however, where the reason we start a sentence with the word however is because we're like contrasting what we're saying now with what came before it. So like, however, the other example I give is on the other hand, some people are not so sure about this. And the comma would go, after on the other hand. There's other words like although gets used like this sometimes. Like if you said although I'm not so sure about this, then the comma would go after although. But then if you said like although I'm not sure about this, I'm going to do it anyway. In that case, the comma would go in the middle of the sentence after I'm not so sure about this. But yeah, so there's opening phrases like that. You can look at those examples. Here's another one. It's called a non-essential clause, and this is basically when we like have something in a sentence. We have like a phrase in a sentence that could be removed and the sentence would make sense without it. But for whatever reason we want to include it. It's important information, it adds to it. So like the example I gave here, I said my mom, comma, who loves movies, comma, is coming over today. So the reason that you use the 2 commas like there is because who loves movies is a non-essential clause. So we could say my mom is coming over today and that would work. But we want to add in this extra part because whatever, it's just I felt it was important to let you know that she likes movies, right? So since it's non-essential, you could remove it and the sentence would still work. You set it off with a comma kind of on both sides there. The next one I have is lists. I think we know how that works. When you have a list of more than 2 things, you use the comma. Leading into a quote, this is a good one, especially if we're using quotes in our essays. If you have a phrase before the quote, like the author writes, or this character says, or somebody explains, if you introduce it with a verb like that, you always want to have a comma after that verb before the quote starts. So like I have here, the author writes, comma, and then the author wrote, I am a dumb idiot, is what I had the author write here in my example. Yeah. Calling someone by name, I don't even know why I included that one. That one's not so important. That's not something that really happens much with art writing. Okay, and then this one I just called like putting it in the middle of the sentence, and there's probably a more technical name for this, but that just made sense to me. So the example I give here, it says, if you are going to the store, comma, pick up some milk. Any sentence that starts with the word if is going to need a comma when it shifts from like if this, then this. There's always going to be a point kind of in the middle there where you need the comma. Another example I gave was, I would go to the store, comma, but I am too tired. So using the word but, you almost always need a comma before the word but. But that's if it could be both its own sentence on each side is the thing. Like I am too tired could be its own sentence. I would go to the store could be its own sentence. So for that reason, I have the comma but, and then it links those 2 things together, and that works. So you also have these times when you use the comma in the middle of the sentence. Another thing that people asked about, and again, if you can just get down with those few comma rules, I think that'll fix most of your problems with commas. Another thing people asked about that I did have written here was the titles of things. And, this is something you might have seen on your literary analysis rough draft, if you handed that in, that, since what we're writing about there is a short story and not like a full-length book, we use quotation marks, right? So basically the way that this works, and again, you should follow along. I have the list here of which titles get italicized, which ones get quotation marks. But the basic thing here is that if it's like the largest version of the thing, it gets italics, and if it's like a smaller unit that goes inside of something else, it gets quotation marks. So like the chapter of a book gets quotation marks, but the name of the book gets italics. A short story gets quotation marks because it goes inside of a book of short stories with like 10 short stories in it, right? And the name of the book would get the italics. Um, so essays, like an essay or an article that you might use as an outside source, that gets quotation marks because usually that would appear inside of a journal or a magazine, and that would be the thing to get the italics. Also, movies, novels, newspapers, academic journals all get italics because there's kind of smaller things that fit in there, right? Like an academic journal has essays inside of it. The essays get quotation marks. The journal gets italics. So there you go. That's how that works. Just something that we have to get used to. Um, I gave you some stuff about colons at the end here. Again, you could get away with just never using a colon, but there's basically two main ways that we use colons. So one of them is introducing a list. So I gave an example here on the last page of this document. It says there are 3 things I need from the store: colon, apples, I think it's supposed to say beer, and bleach. So really the time when you use a colon is when you like set up what you're about to say that way. There are 3 things I need from the store, and then you're going to give me the list, right? So whenever you frame it and phrase it in that kind of way, where you're like setting up the next thing you're going to say, you use a colon. Like the other example that I gave, this one's more adding emphasis, but I put, there was only one thing standing in Batman's way, colon, the Joker. So it's because of the specific phrasing of like setting up that last thing. Like if you said like I saw something really scary at the mall, a giant rat. Same thing, colon. I saw something scary at the mall, colon, a giant rat. It's because you're kind of setting up the next thing. So that's how you use a colon. And then the semicolon, since people asked about it, basically a semicolon. So I was talking before with the comma splices about having like what could be its own sentence, what could stand alone as its own sentence. If you have like 2 things that could be their own sentences, but they're related to each other for some reason, one way you can stick them together is just by putting a semicolon in the middle. So the thing with a semicolon is that the thing on each side of the semicolon needs to be an independent clause, meaning that on each side of the semicolon you have to have what could be its own sentence. It could grammatically be its own sentence if we wanted it to, but if they're like related to each other or something, so we want to stick them together. It's basically instead of using like a comma and the word and or the word but or whatever, you can just stick them together with a semicolon. Again, you could avoid using that and kind of be fine. But that's how they work.